I'm Susan Earle. I'm the curator of European and American art here at the Spencer Museum, and we're going to talk with Wendell Castle, who is here visiting us, about his works in this exhibition called Wendell Castle About Time. So we thought we'd start with this clock. And what would you like to tell us, just briefly, about this clock?
Well, I think the name makes it obvious where the inspiration came from, the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And what it has in common with what I envisioned Dr. Caligari's furniture looking like. In the movie, there is some furniture, and the sets and the furniture and everything are a little bit wacky. And the sets are also painted with sort of broad brush strokes, a little Franz Klein-like. So those were what I borrowed from the movie. And the inside has those broad brush strokes and black and white, but there's a tiny bit of blue in the black. And I think that the blue came from the fact that some really old movies, black and white movies, to me have a little blue tint to them. I don't know whether that's my imagination or whether they've aged, or maybe that's not true at all, but I saw it that way. So the wackiness, the fact that where the 3, 6, and 9, and 12 are, the whole thing's a little bit tilted, the hands go a little wacky. The piece is not symmetrical at all, the different facets are all different sizes. The weights mimic the shape of the overall piece somewhat. And it's actually a traditional grandfather clock. You have to wind, and it has chimes, so it's, in a sense, kind of old-fashioned.
And the chimes are beautiful. Are they something that you created, or are they an existing set
No,
of chimes?
it's a very, very expensive works. If you can buy very high-quality European works for these things, and you can pick what it plays.
And there are 2 or 3 different ones, I think. Is that right?
Well, different for the time, for the hour and the half hour are different.
Right. And then for the hour, I think, could one choose between a different melody? That's what I remember when we were setting this up.
Well, I can't remember that part.
But it's very charming. I love the combination of how charming the chimes are and how wild the clock is.
Well, I think that's an interesting aspect, that it's old and new. I mean, the shape is kind of traditional.
Right.
And the fact that traditional grandfather clocks generally did open, although they usually had a window that opened.
Right.
And I didn't want a window.
So we're showing this open, but it would just be closed, and you would see the blue all the way down if it were
Right,
closed.
it's all blue on the back side. And there is a lock to lock it up. And I see the crank inside that you used to wind it,
Oh, yes.
which is stored inside, which we made the crank too. But we didn't alter the actual clockworks, like in some of the ones we did, alter them.
To make them do what you wanted them.
Make them do what I want to do, but ultimately that turned out to be a big problem, because then nobody knows how to fix it. And this could be fixed by a traditional watch clockmaker.
Right. And so when we installed this, we had a grandfather clock specialist come and help us with
Oh, because it's very hard to set the chimes right. It's easy to set the time right, but then to get the chimes and the time together is a bit of a challenge.
So that was what he was doing then, really?
Yeah.
Because I wasn't even quite sure what
No, he would have been making sure the chimes happened at the right time.
So you've had to know something about clocks or clock mechanisms then to make these, like to know how to alter it. You've had to know something.
Well, yes, to know how to alter it. But I had, at that particular point in time, a young fellow working for me who was quite mechanically inclined. And we got a bit carried away in terms of making some parts for clocks we probably shouldn't have done.
So should we...
So the opposite,
Yes.
by the way, the opposite of this is that,
Okay.
which really doesn't have the slightest thing to do with traditional clockmaking, but yet it has that size. But it works like an egg timer.
So you were saying that we've gone from the earliest clock to the most recent.
This is the most recent, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that I really don't want to get caught up in the mechanisms that are complex and try to keep it really simple. So this is trying to keep it really simple. But yet, I wanted it to have sort of the presence of a grandfather clock. But this just works like an egg timer. It just goes around, and so I didn't have to do anything to the clockworks. And the way you set the time is just pick up that hat and move it to where it's supposed to be and set it back. Unlike that one. It takes 3 people to set the time. No. But this is a form that I've been playing around with quite a lot in my sculpture, this sort of donut form, which I think of as a ring, something that has no beginning and no end, like time. So I thought it was appropriate. And this just makes reference to the vertical thing that you would expect of a tall case clock. And I enjoy the way they intersect, that one is mushing into the other.
Yes. Which is a wonderful sculptural kind of
Yeah,
feeling.
it's very nice when you mush 2 shapes together as you get another shape. So, and it's really just super simple, and it's got one of these very elaborate hot rod paint jobs with a metal flake in there that only shows up where the highlights are, but is actually everywhere. So if you lit it differently, that would move.
So are these cast in fiberglass, or how does you're
These
an
are
expert
cast.
in working in fiberglass? Tell
Well,
us
I don't
about
do the
this.
fiberglass work. I make an original, and I send it out to a fiberglass factory, and they make a mold, and then they make the pieces, and we paint them. Well, we do the final prep, then paint
Right.
them. They don't come back this perfect, so we have to work on them.
So you actually work on the finished surface with
Right.
how you want it to
Mhm.
appear. And is
And-
that how you get the colors?
It's hot rod paint
Mm.
that's got many layers in it, and a layer under this little green is this layer of purple that only shows up where highlights are. And this is an edition of 8. This is the second one.
Right. So there are others out there.
One other,
One other.
yes.
Oh, okay, so you've only made 2.
I only make them as I sell them.
Oh, that's smart.
So this is the second one made.
And so this is, do you view that these very fluid forms are going back to some ideas that you've had in the past, or a new direction?
Well,
or
and they
both?
go back a little bit. They go back, I think, the simplicity of the earlier fiberglass pieces. I kept it simple for a different reason then, however, because I didn't want to get into complicated molds. And now I am into complicated molds, but the forms are still simple. They're simple in a different way. So there's definitely a relationship. No.
And do you want to tell us anything about the title? You had called this Yesterday is Here, and then you changed the
Well,
title.
yeah, it was my Mark Bender from my New York gallery at Friedman Benda. He says, you got to name some of these pieces that have something to do with Kansas. And actually, I thought, well, that's not a bad idea. So he said, how about, he'd actually done a little research before he called me and looked on the map, and he said, there's a bunch of good names. And he's from Switzerland.
Oh, so he had no idea.
He had
where they
no
were.
idea about anything from Kansas. He'd never been here.
Right.
He's only lived in the United States about 6 years or so. And so, he suggested Topeka for one, and Emporia and Wichita, and I thought, well, that's okay. I think that's maybe a nice tribute.
That's great.
But we didn't lose Lawrence because he thought that's a person's name.
Right. It didn't somehow have
Somehow
that.
it didn't have, Topeka was a word, he had no concept of Topeka meaning anything to him. And the same with Wichita and Emporia. Those are not words that he knew. Foreigners don't know those words.
Right.
So that people in Europe will not know anything about that word.
Yeah, so he really was just picking it as a word.
as a word. But they had meaning to me.
Right.
He knew that. Well, this one kind of falls halfway in between those two. So the mechanism in this one is actually fairly simple. But I think what's neat about it is there's no way to know what it is. Because there are no numbers, there is no face, there are no hands, and none of the things that clocks traditionally have. And the sculptural shape really doesn't have any meaning in relationship to time. But it was absolutely necessary to make this work, is it has a big fat end and a little end. Those were givens, and that it be round because it had to roll. So there's an early drawing over here that actually has a different shape and even a different mechanism. But then, as I got into it a little deeper, I realized the battery is going to have a lot of weight in it, and I could make the weight do the movement. Because essentially what it is, and there's a teeny, teeny little motor, about 1 cockroach power, and there, it just moved. That's what it's supposed to do. And that, through a lot of gearing, has enough power to try to lift that motor. And when the motor is being lifted, obviously the part that would move the easiest moves first, and that rolls easier than it is for it to lift the battery. So it tries to lift the battery, but since it can't, it makes it roll, so the battery still stays on the bottom. But what this was really kind of about, and why I thought this made sense, is that, I don't know a lot about this, but Einstein, in some of his theories about time, suggested that time sort of moved in fits and starts. That time did not move regularly. And this does not move regularly. It's because of the imperfections in the sculpture and the imperfections in the floor, that as it's trying to move, if it hits a little something that causes a little resistance, the battery has to move further up to get enough momentum to propel it beyond whatever sort of was holding it back. So it just made a quick movement. So either it was probably, the floor looks pretty good. It must have been a certain irregularity in the piece, because this is not absolutely regular. I didn't want it. That would have defeated it.
Right.
If this had been perfect and that had been perfect, you would not have gotten those irregular things happening, which that lets you know it's moved. You'd have to stand here quite a while to see something happen, but it does happen.
Well, what a great way to convey that sense of the fits and starts that, was so much part of the design. And you wanted to suggest that, but then
Right.
it worked out perfectly in how the piece evolved.
Yeah, and you actually can determine the time, more or less. As this is set up with that direction, which I believe is north, is 12 o'clock. So you can see that 3 would have been here, so this is approximately 4 o'clock. So you can tell time within, say, 10 minutes, something like that, which for most things, that's close enough.
Right. Well, and it's great too, because people, they look for the hands or the face, perhaps, and then this gives them a whole new idea.
Yeah, a lot of people
not
think there
having
should have been a face here,
Ah,
but that would have been dumb.
right. Well, and I love the way, so we've the grandfather clocks, and then we've come onto the floor, and something that really is a whole room installation, but that it, refuses to have the face or the things we expect.
I mean, and I'll probably say something about this evening, that it's changed from unusual ways to tell time to things that are about time.
Oh, that's great. That is wonderful.
And I actually have a lot of ideas, but they're not very practical. And most people won't give up this much space in their house
Right.
for something that's only going to get them sort of approximate time.
Well, that's a good point. If we all had to have clocks that were this big, we probably would give up having to tell time. But it's, I mean, I know you've had it in your studio, and it's great. This is the first time I think that it's been
It has been.
shown, and it looks so great in this kind of space. But you're
Yeah,
right, it would be hard to have in someone's
I
home.
see it's 11 years old.
Which is, so we started in the 20th century and now in the 21st century.
That's right. But I'm really glad that it's got a chance to be shown.
Yes, well, and it's so captivating here. It's just really, there's something about the form lying on the floor that people are really excited about, and they're curious because they can't quite figure it out.
Yeah, and it's nice space here, right inside the front door.
Yes.
Lots of room around it.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us about
Great.
your pieces about time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.